Real Faces of Dairy project was launched by Balchem Animal Nutrition and Health in 2016 as a way to celebrate dairy industry pioneers and visionaries, past, present, and future. It was a way to share our passion for the agricultural lifestyle and flood the internet with positive images of the dairy industry. As the program grew, we continued to celebrate the families that work together every day to ensure the future of their operation and the sustainability of this way of life. We celebrate the dedication of so many to producing high-quality food. We share the story of passion, perseverance, and an intense dedication to the animal, the land, family, and the community. As part of the Real Faces of Dairy celebration, Balchem commissioned the Birth of an Industry painting in 2016 from legendary artist Bonnie Moore. It became a symbol of hope and new beginnings, a unique tribute to agriculture and the dairy industry, bringing meaning to the values we all share. The painting celebrates the foundation and future of agriculture, invoking the spirit of pride, love, and hope that is the very essence of who we are and what we do. In 2020, Balchem unveiled the expanding Birth of an Industry family. The new print, titled Generations, is the next painting in the series of Real Faces of Dairy art. Commissioned from renowned artist Larry Schultz, we now see the next generation of love and life. Just like many farm families pass the torch to their children to sustain the land and care for the animals, Mr. Schultz captures the next generation of this iconic dairy cow family that was first presented in the Bonnie Moore painting. Today, the Real Faces of Dairy family has grown to more than 70,000 on our Facebook page and continues to expand on other social media channels. With the support of so many, we are able to share hundreds of photos every week, deliver thousands of coloring books destined to educate young children, and produce a yearly calendar celebrating the dairy industry. And now we ask you to join the celebration. Visit us on Facebook at Real Faces of Dairy. Share your photos of what makes the dairy industry so special. Encourage your non-agricultural friends to see the caring and passion we have for agriculture, and help us spread the message of how dairy is done right all around the world. At Balchem Animal Nutrition and Health, we strive every day to deliver results you can see in your animal's productivity and your bottom line. From a smooth transition into the milking string for your fresh cows, to a happy welcome home from your furry friend. From a strong start in your poultry flock, to consistent weight gains for your finishing hogs. We expect to earn your business and your trust with our people, our products, and our science. Our people have an intense passion for your animals and your success. You can count on us for honest, candid advice and practical solutions for your toughest challenges. As the global leader in choline production, chelation, and encapsulation technology, we take our obligation to you and to the environment seriously. Our products are backed by the most extensive and thorough research portfolio, while our business is committed to advancing environmental sustainability and animal welfare. In the end, it all comes down to results. Balchem delivers real results you can count on, results that exceed your expectations, and results that bring true value to your bottom line. Leading the charge to meet the nutritional needs of ruminants, monogastrics, and companion animals, Balchem offers a growing portfolio of nutritional products and a dedication to innovation and industry sustainability. Balchem is here to solve today and shape tomorrow.
Hello everyone, my name is Scott Sorrell, Director of Global Marketing for Balchem, and I'll be your moderator today. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the next installment of Balchem's Real Science Lecture Series. Today's Real Science webinar is titled Supplemental Fatty Acids, Much More Than Just Fat and Energy, presented by Dr. Adam Locke from Michigan State University. Today's webinar is also being presented in Spanish, so welcome to all of our Spanish-speaking friends. If anyone is having trouble accessing the translation service, please alert us by typing a request into the questions box on your control panel, and we'll have people standing by to help you. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. We've taken a screenshot of the attendee interface. You should see something like this on your screen, on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You're listening in using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. For the Spanish translation service, you can scan the QR code here to access the translated audio. Please reach out to us via the chat box if you are experiencing any difficulties, and we can give you more specific instructions on how to troubleshoot the problems. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to Dr. Locke by typing them into the questions pane on the control panel. You may send your questions at any time during the webinar. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. If we don't have time to answer your specific question today, we'll send a follow-up email to today's attendees with answers to all the questions submitted during the presentation. There are several handouts available during today's session, including a copy of the slides, translation access instructions, and a participation certificate to claim your ARPA CEU credits. All are available on the Handouts tab on the control panel. The slides and ARPA certificate will also be available following the webinar at balchemanh.com/realscience. I would now like to introduce Dr. Locke. Adam is an associate professor in the Department of Animal Science at Michigan State University. He is originally from the UK, where he grew up on a dairy farm and received his PhD from the University of Nottingham. Dr. Locke completed his postdoc work there and also at Cornell University. He did additional research and teaching work at the University of Vermont before moving to his current research and extension appointment at Michigan State University. Dr. Locke's research focus is on both animal production and human nutrition, with the central theme of fatty acid digestion and metabolism. Dr. Locke, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Scott. Welcome, everyone. I appreciate the invite from Scott and everyone at Balchem for inviting me to give this talk here today. It's a pleasure to be here. It's nice to give a talk. I was just saying to my wife a few minutes ago, I'm not sure the last time I gave a seminar or a webinar like this, so it's nice to be doing this, and I hope everyone is healthy and safe and well. So as Scott said, I'm really going to give an overview of probably the work we've mostly done the last 5 to 6 years, and trying to better understand supplemental fatty acids, supplemental fat. As you'll see when we go through here, really try and move away from that simple term of supplemental fat. We need to be talking about different fatty acids. Much how we've moved away a lot from talking about crude protein to talking about amino acids, we're now really talking mostly, or we should be talking mostly about fatty acids rather than just fat. All of the fatty acids we're going to be talking about today, they basically pretty much have the same energy on a like-for-like fatty acid basis. All bags of supplemental fat can have pretty much the same energy, but as I'm going to show as we go through here, how those cows digest and absorb and utilize these fatty acids is going to vary markedly depending on which fatty acids, which blends of fatty acids we're going to be talking about. So I think we all know that classic sort of fat contains about 2.2 or twice as much energy as carbohydrates and forages, concentrates and forages here. And and a primary reason why we first initially got interested in supplemental fat was to increase energy density of the diet, hopefully increase energy intake. So as we go through here, I'm going to hopefully show today that fatty acids are much more than simply energy, and we're starting to understand a lot more now about this, what I'd call the caloric versus the non-caloric effects of these individual fatty acids. It's these non-caloric effects I think is going to be key here in the future. So my own program, my lab group program here constitutes many different people, some outstanding students and undergraduate, graduate, lab managers. It's really focused on understanding the impact of different dietary fatty acids. Of course, when we think about most fatty acids in the diet, these 5 fatty acids are typically going to make up over 95% of all fatty acids in the diet. So we have palmitic, stearic, oleic, linolenic. I'm not going to go into detail where these are all in the diet. It's going to really focus on the supplemental fat piece here. But really, unless you're feeding a specific or quite unique omega-3 type product or a medium chain fatty acid product, these fatty acids are always going to be the bulk of the fatty acids in the diet, okay? Or certainly at least available to the cow as well once we leave the rumen. So we've been interested in the role of these fatty acids have maybe in the rumen, whether that be on biohydrogenation, milk fat depression, fiber digestibility, feed intake regulation. We've done a lot, and I'm going to spend quite a bit of time looking at fatty acid digestibility, fatty acid absorption. I think that's a key sort of gatekeeper on choice of supplemental fats and a first pass on whether a fat supplement is a good choice or not. Of course, our focus has heavily been on milk fat production, milk component yields, and more lately, we've been focusing with my collaborator, Dr. Contreras, in our vet school, a lot on the role of different fatty acids on adipose tissue metabolism, particularly in the fresh cow, and that's where I'm going to end today's talk. I think in the future, there's going to be a lot more interest in the role of different fatty acids, for example, omega-3s, around immune function, reproduction. I think immune function is a very interesting aspect of that there. So where is supplemental fat feeding today? I just grabbed this screenshot a while ago. There's a huge amount of different fat supplements out there, and it's complicated. I don't think a week goes by where I don't get an email saying, what do you think about this new product or that new product? There's a lot of different products out there, lots of different trade names. I think in general, these can be broken up into 3 different groups, but it is complicated. And so I gave a talk spent about half a day a couple of years ago in Australia, giving a talk about this, and one of my colleagues down there kind of summarized everything up that I said quite succinctly and basically said, so you're telling me, Adam, that a bag of fat's not just a bag of fat. And that's really the take-home message here. We need to think about this next time any of you in the field or at the mills are being offered a different type of fat supplement. Number one question is, what's the fatty acid profile of it? That fatty acid profile, I believe, in any fat supplement is going to be the first factor in determining the response to it. And this is really my key take-home message today. Always want to know what's the fatty acid profile of that bag of fat that I'm being offered or I'm going to be using on my farm. So that's going to impact primarily how it's going to work in the cow, I believe. I did a similar webinar to this at Hordes a while ago. That allowed me to ask some questions during it, the webinars that Dr. Hutchins puts together. And I thought that was an interesting one. So we got to ask, why do you choose to feed fatty acids? I think historically, people said it was around body weight loss. And I think some people still consider that a primary goal. And we'll perhaps touch on that later. But I think it's interesting as we start to understand this more and more now, that it was primarily around increasing the yield of milk and milk components. That's why people were choosing to feed fat supplements now, and less so on some of these other things. And of course, I think this is a good academic answer here as well, isn't it? Well, it depends. And I think that's totally correct. Depending on what your management goals are or which group of cows it is, it will depend on which fatty acids you want to feed and what type of responses you're going to get to them as well. So how is a nutritionist to decide on all these different fat products? So hopefully as we go through here today, I'm going to discuss many of these and hopefully give some answers to these around different types of fat supplements are out there. I'm going to show you some of the newer concepts, hopefully break dogma around some of these things around feed intake, fiber digestibility, fresh cow feeding, and fat supplements. I'm going to talk about the importance of fatty acid digestibility. Show a lot of our newer work on oleic acid. I think that's an exciting area where we can have some big impacts in the future. And then particularly show some of our work with different blends of fatty acids across early lactation and high producing dairy cows. As I said earlier, when I showed that picture, there's really kind of 3 major categories of fat supplements that are out there. The first 2 are really the calcium salts of palm oil or palm fatty acid distillate rich in palmitic and oleic acid. And then also the mixed saturated prils that are a combination of palmitic and stearic, predominantly stearic acid in general. And then over the last probably decade, we've seen a lot more of these palmitic acid enriched type products, which by their name, is they're obviously enriched in palmitic acid. I think it's always important to remember that none of these supplements were originally designed with the cow in mind. They simply took a best byproduct and a respective manufacturing technology to allow them to produce a dry fat and a fat that was manageable and handleable on farm and in feed mills. It never initially had the fatty acid profile of them in mind. Now, I contend I'm going to focus my talk on these 3 fatty acids. They're the major ones here, palmitic, stearic, oleic. They're all important for dairy cow metabolism because of biohydrogenation. Stearic acid is always the major fatty acid available to the cow, so we always need to be thinking about stearic acid. But we are starting to ask ourselves, are there some ideal ratios amongst these at different stages of lactation that maybe will optimize their utilization? And what other dietary, I'll show you some work later on, different fat levels in the diet, what other animal factors lower versus high producing cows, and many others that I think we need to look at. What other interactions are there here? If we look back 8 years ago now, Ravi et al. Did a meta-analysis. I'll show you some work we're doing on some meta-analysis right now, where they looked in general at supplemental fat. There was a heavy focus on calcium salts in this meta-analysis, but in general, supplementing fat reduced intake, increased milk volume, increased milk fat and protein percentage, reduced fat and protein percentages, but protein yield stayed the same, fat yield went up. And then they talked about feed efficiency. I think the big thing for me that took home from this study was that different fat sources had very different responses. Remember, this data set predominantly focused on calcium salts, but even within a fat supplement, there were some very different effects. Postdoc with me, Jose Neto and Jonas de Souza have been working on some meta-analysis. Hopefully we get these submitted soon, where we widened up the data set here and did a much broader data set where we're looking at calcium salts or PFAD, the mixed prills, so stearic, palmitic prills, and then palmitic acid enriched prills. I'm not going to go through this in too much detail. I've put this in here really for you in the handouts for your own reference, but we're kind of seeing what effects that we would kind of expect from our recent data here. And when we're looking at digestibility, we see that these calcium salt products tend to increase fat NDF and fatty acid digestibility. So going against that old dogma about feeding fat, lowering fiber digestibility. I'll show you a good slide in a minute from Luar Montano's group on that. Mixed prills, no effect on dry matter NDF digestibility, but as you've seen from some of our work in the past, they do generally reduce total fatty acid digestibility. And with these palmitic acid in prill, dry matter goes up, digestibility goes up predominantly because of this consistent improvement we see in NDF digestibility. Show some more data on that in a minute, and no effect on fatty acid digestibility. So you can start to see some differences here across these based on the fatty acid profile, what impacts they have on digestibility. This is that slide up from Luar Montano's group. We don't need to really focus on the different types of models they used here, but it really challenged that old concept that feeding fat lower fiber digestibility. That was very prevalent in some of that early work. When you look at a lot of that early work, they're also feeding often highly unsaturated types of fats, but predominantly at very high levels. And so when Lou looked at this at the lower levels across a wide range of fat intakes here, with a lot of different fat products as shown here, you can see here that in general, apart from these, what I call the coconut, palm kernel oil type medium chain fatty acid products, none of the typical types of fat supplements here had any specific positive or negative effect on fiber digestibility. So I think we need to move away from that old concept that feeding fat lowers fiber digestibility. This study from Jonas de Souza highlights that nicely, where we had a control here and then 3 different fat blends supplemented at 1.5% fat in the diet, and we had a high palmitic, a palmitic stearic blend, and then a palmitic and oleic blend. And you can see here, I think this was our first study where we started to show that feeding palmitic acid increased fiber digestibility, the palmitic stearic lowered it, and a slight increase of the palmitic oleic. Granted, we saw a lower feed intake, dry matter intake with this one, but this was very consistent response. Marin Weston, who finished her master's with me last year, showed this again further, where we took 2 commercial fat supplements, a palmitic stearic prill versus a palmitic acid enriched prill here, 80% palmitic. Again, we see this nice improvement here in palmitic acid compared to no added fat, no supplemental fat, whereas the palmitic stearic had no effect here. So again, this different concept, different types of fatty acids going to have different impacts here. When we started to look at this, and we need to add to this data more with over the last few years now, we do see a nice relationship that as we drive increased palmitic acid intake, we are getting improvements in total tract NDF digestibility. Fernando Batistell at Utah State recently had an abstract of Dairy Science showing in an in vitro model that this is we're pretty confident that this is a rumen effect here on this. We don't really know exactly why, but maybe there's some data from Jeff Erkin showing that some of those Butyrfibrio species, some of those prevalent fiber digesters do grow better maybe in a higher palmitic acid environment. So maybe we're stimulating more of those, or maybe we're altering feed intake, feeding patterns as well. We don't really know that, but it's a very consistent response, which of course we can't really capture any of that in a model system right now. So when we look at fatty acid digestibility here now, I think this is an interesting series of slides here. When we fed the palmitic acid enriched pre-roll, no difference to control, similar to what I showed in that meta-analysis earlier. When we came in with the stearic acid, so we halved the palmitic and brought in stearic acid, we have a big drop in digestibility. And this is where we started to get interested in the oleic acid here. When we came in with some oleic acid, we improved fiber digestibility, fatty acid digestibility, even beyond that we had in the no fatty acid supplementary control. So even though there's 1.5% more fatty acids in this treatment compared to control, we still got a better and improved fatty acid digestibility. So I think fatty acid digestibility is important. I don't really need to focus on the numbers here, but when we split that study out between the low fat versus our high fat diet and just did a Lucas test here and plotted out supplemental intake versus supplemental fatty acids absorbed, you can start to see how digestibility, even though we're talking about fatty acids that may only go anywhere from 2 to 5 or 6% of the diet, a low nutrient amount in the diet compared to other nutrients, we can have profound effects on the amount of fatty acids that are being absorbed by that cow. And this was shown nicely in Marin's recent study here, where we had the control, the palmitic stearic supplement and the palmitic enriched supplement. And again, we see those differences in digestibility. There's almost about a 10-unit difference in total fatty acid digestibility between the palmitic stearic versus the palmitic acid enriched. Now, in this study, we did bomb calorimetry to get actual energy intakes on these cows. And you can see here when we plotted out digestible energy intake, a nice improvement here in digestible energy intake compared to control and compared to the palmitic stearic. And in this case, because we had lower digestibility, we really didn't get any, even though we fed this supplemental fatty acids here, we didn't get any more digestible energy into the cow than we did the control treatment. So I think digestibility is a big important here. Now, important to remember, this jump up here in digestible energy intake is driven by fatty acid digestibility, but also driven by NDF digestibility as well. So we've been looking at this about opportunities for improving stearic acid digestibility, or the effect that different fatty acids may have on digestibility. This is an abstract Crystal Prom, who just finished her PhD with me earlier this year, did where we made some blends where we kept the set level of palmitic acid in these blends about 40%, and then we altered the proportion of palmitic and stearic and oleic, sorry, so 50% stearic, 10 oleic, up to a 30-30 stearic oleic. And you can see here, no added control. When we came in with that high stearic, as we would expect from those previous studies I showed you, these are again fed at 1.5%, these supplement blends. We drop digestibility, and as we slowly pull out some stearic and bring in a bit of oleic acid here, we start to rescue and bring back up fatty acid digestibility. So we think oleic acid is an important component here for micelle formation, improving overall fatty acid absorption in that small intestine of the cow. Crystal showed that also in her PhD studies, in a paper that should be submitted soon here, where we did actual abomasal infusions. Of course, when we're feeding oleic acid, it's predominantly fed in a calcium salt. We know a fairly high proportion of that oleic acid and that salt is still going to go under biohydrogenation. But we know, we're confident we're getting some oleic acid through. But we did a proof of concept study here where we abomasally infused either 0, 20, 40, or 60 grams a day of oleic acid and looked at total tract fatty acid digestibility. And you can see as soon as we get just 20 grams of additional oleic acid bypassing the rumen into the small intestine, we see this nice jump up in fatty acid digestibility, giving us confidence that if we can alter the profile of fatty acids, but leaving the rumen available in the small intestine, we can have improvements on fatty acid digestibility. We've looked at that now with oleic acid. We've also been asking questions about, are there other exogenous emulsifiers? Lysolethicin is the major endogenous emulsifier in the small intestine of a dairy cow. We've been asking ourselves, with higher and higher intakes, higher and higher fatty acid intakes of cows, are there some situations, particularly with that high amount of stearic acid leaving the rumen and maybe adding in some more in the diet, are some of these cows maybe limited on emulsification capacity? And so what happens if we could supply some more exogenous emulsifier? And the first one we looked at was polysorbate 80. Many of you will have heard of Tween 80. That's one of the commercial names, a very popular commercial name for a non-iactant surfactant and emulsifier. So we have amazingly infused that. This is a study Jonas and Marin did a few years ago, just came out earlier this year now. Again, we have amazingly infused at 15, 30, or 45 grams a day. And again, you see at that 30 gram, we improve fatty acid digestibility by 10 percentage units. This is a basal diet which we had a Palmitic stearic acid prill in the basal diet. And we're only adding in this 30 grams of this emulsifier, this nice improvement in fatty acid digestibility. So I think going forward, there are opportunities to maybe delivering specific fatty acids, delivering specific emulsifiers that may allow us to improve overall fatty acid digestibility, which is then going to help improve overall nutrient capture from that diet. Clearly, right now in the field, the biggest opportunity we have that I think is with oleic acid, and I've shown some of that data, and you'll see some more of that as we go through here now. So what do I think is the major limitation on fatty acid digestibility? I think it's that profile of fatty acids reaching the small intestine is the number one thing. And then I think emulsification capacity is the second piece of that. So, you know, I think often people think forward it's just total fatty acid flow to the duodenum. But I think from a lot of the data we've shown here, I think that profile is probably the major key thing there. So I just saw a note from Scott. I get a little excitable talking about some of this research, so I will try and slow down a bit. Sorry about that, Scott. So clearly, across multiple studies, we know that ruminants have a much better capacity to absorb saturated free fatty acids compared to non-ruminants. Pigs, for example, really can't absorb free stearic acid at all. And as I said earlier on, I think in nearly every situation, everyone that's on this webinar is going to be seeing stearic acid is always going to be the major fatty acid available for absorption, okay? Because of, you know, linoleic, linolenic acid, the major dietary fatty acids, biohydrogenation, converting them to stearic acid. So a great challenge we have going forward, and I think a great opportunity going forward, is what can we do to improve stearic acid absorption, or certainly limits its effects or negative effects on the absorption of other fatty acids. And I think with this oleic acid, this emulsifier work, I think we have some very interesting, exciting opportunities that are directly relatable and translatable into the field right now. So let's move on to some of the production effects here. This is that meta-analysis that Jose and Jonas have been working on recently, just showing here feed intake and then milk and then fat and energy corrected milk here. As you can see for the 3 different types. Just quickly go through these again. Typically, as the Rabi meta showed, and also we see here, and Mike Allen has showed in the past, and other people, we typically, in a straight calcium salt type product, we typically see a drop in feed intake, but improvements in milk yield and milk component yields as well. With the mixed prills, no effect on intake, and we see improvements in milk and component yields. And then more recent, the newer data, much of it coming from our lab, Kevin Harvey and other people, palmitic acid enriched prills, no effect in intake. This is a misconception that some people get confused about. I find there's no data here. You can see this P.085. There's no scientific literature out there to support overall negative effect of these palmitic acid enriched prills on feed intake. And I challenge anyone to tell me different on that. Again, we see nice improvements in milk yield, fat and energy corrected milk higher, certainly higher here than what we see for some of these others here. But again, again, in general, we see these overall benefits on milk component yields here. I think I need that. So focus in on our palmitic acid work and then expand that to our palmitic and oleic work here. This is a slide Jonas put together a few years ago, similar to what I showed with NDF digestibility earlier. When you increase palmitic acid intake, in general, we increase milk fat yield. And I'm sure many of you have seen that in the field, but it seems to be a pretty linear effect. There's going to be some tailing off on that, I think, depending if you're feeding too high levels, you have a negative effect on digestibility and some of those. But we certainly, this is a general concept here. There's some good data showing how and why palmitic acid may stimulate more milk fat yield in terms of initiating triglyceride synthesis in the mammary gland, the key importance of palmitic acid to milk fat synthesis. So I think if we're supplying more palmitic acid to that cow, we should in general always be helping to produce more milk fat yield. We published this study 2 years ago now, Jonas D'Souza. This was a longer term 10-week study that we did in the summer of, I think, 2017, where we fed a no added fat control and then 1.5% of palmitic acid enriched krill. And you can see a very consistent response. We did this study after, a lot of our early work was done with 2, 3, 4 week periods, and we wanted to take this out for 10 weeks. These are post-peak cows, very nice high producing cows. And this was an interesting one done during the summer period here in Michigan when, it was a hotter weather, where we got some nice improvements in energy corrected milk, fat and protein yield without differences in body weight. This is another misperception that is propagated occasionally out there about when you feed palmitic acid in post-peak cows, you lose body weight. That's simply not true. There's no data to support that. Plasma NEFA will always be higher whenever you're feeding supplemental fat because there's more fatty acids absorbed, typically more circulating triglycerides, and you're going to get some of those triglycerides leaking some fatty acids back into the system, but there's not indicative of body weight loss. Now, we'll talk differently about the fresh cow in a minute, but in post-peak cows, feeding palmitic acid is going to encourage and promote more nutrients to be driven to the mammary gland because we're talking about more energy corrected milk, but it's not, these cows are not losing body weight in that post-peak period. This is a study that was recently published, again, out of Fernando Batistill's lab at Utah State. And I would like to show this one because this is a nice study where they fed either no added fat or a palmitic acid enriched krill, but they had Jerseys and Holstein cows in this. So, most of the work's been done with Holsteins. All of our own work has been done with Holsteins. And you can see just basically similar responses in both Jerseys and Holsteins in terms of milk fat yield and milk protein yield in this study. So that's good to see, as we see more of these different breeds, mixed breeds, that the responses we're seeing in the Holsteins here are pretty similar across the different breeds as well. So back to Marin's study, where we had the no added fat and then the palmitic stearic krill versus the palmitic acid enriched krill. These are 2 commercial supplements. Energy corrected milk higher for the palmitic acid krill compared to the other treatments you can see here, and primarily driven because of fat yield. You see, if you remember that palmitic stearic, we didn't get any more energy into the cows with the low digestibility, and that gets translated to no differences compared to control in energy corrected milk and fat yield. And again, importantly, no differences here as you can see here, no significant differences here in body weight change. Again, this is not a negative value here for that palmitic acid. Don't get fooled into some of those ideas where feeding palmitic acid in these post-peak cows is going to drop body weight. So when we look at Jonas's study here, again, where we first started getting interested in oleic acid, again, what we would expect to see here, the high palmitic drove energy corrected milk the most because of the fat yield response. We've got, as I showed earlier, we've got energy corrected milk responses for all 3 of these fat treatments. It was higher for the high palmitic acid treatment. This got us interested in that oleic acid, so we then started in Jonas's work to manipulate the palmitic to oleic acid ratio in fat blend. So 80-10, 80% palmitic, 10 oleic, 60-30, 60 palmitic, 30 oleic. I'm going to talk a lot about this 60-30 blend as we go through. In this study from Jonas that we did published last year, we had what we called a lower group of cows and a medium group and a high group, just showing the low and high here for simplicity. You can see in that lower group of cows, the highest Palmitic blend resulted in the highest energy corrected milk. But in the very high group of cows, these were all pretty high producing cows. It was that 60-30 blend, so that higher oleic blend, where we got a nice jump up in milk production. Well, we've repeated this more recently. Marin Weston has a paper, I think it's available online in Journal Dairy Science now, where we did the 80-10 and 60-30 blends across a wider range of production. We saw similar responses. Those very high producing cows seem like they do better with that higher oleic acid blend, and the lower lactation cows are doing better. And when I say lower, these are still 80-90 pound cows. They're doing better on that higher palmitic acid blend. Now, if we look at body weight change here, I've kind of focused on this, talked about this a little already. Again, in Jones's study, again, that palmitic acid, high palmitic, no differences in body weight change compared to the control cows. No differences here either. But that high oleic, actually, those cows gained more body weight. It was about 0.2 kilos more body weight gain per day compared to control. This is an interesting treatment in this particular study. They gave more milk than control and gained more body weight. So overall, sort of nutrient capture from that diet was very good. In Jonas's other study here, when we altered the palmitic and oleic blends, you can see we had no effect across production levels. But as we increased the oleic acid content of that blend, these are all supplemented. But as we went from that 10% oleic up to 30% oleic, in general, we saw an increase in body weight change in these cows. So it's looking like here that we get some improvements in absorption, digestibility with oleic acid, but we are also getting some shifts in nutrient partitioning in the cow as well. And in these post-peak cows, it was promoting greater body weight gain. So a recent study that Alicia Birch just finished up her master's, now doing her PhD with me, presented last year at Dairy Science. Of course, when we're feeding those higher oleic blends, it's more with a calcium salt. As I said earlier, we know some of that salt is going to be broken down in the rumen. So we asked ourselves, was it really an oleic acid effect or a stearic acid effect? And just showing just very quickly here in that very high cow where we expected that palmitic oleic blend to perform the best. It did, especially compared to the palmitic stearic. So we're pretty confident that there's this direct effect of the palmitic, the oleic acid in that blend in those higher producing cows. Interestingly, in this study, the palmitic stearic, so 60% palmitic, 30% stearic here, performed the best in that lower producing group of cows. So we're interested in different ratios of palmitic and stearic now as well. Well, only really if we can get that, make sure we get that stearic acid absorbed in the cow. I'm going to skip those ones quickly for time. So where we think it's interesting right now, as I've kind of shown there earlier, that some of these different fatty acids have different effects on energy partitioning. I showed earlier on that as we drove more palmitic acid intake, we got more energy partitioning to milk, and this is shown nicely here in some data that Jonas put together, this individual cow data. See, energy partitioning to milk increases primarily because of higher milk fat yields. In that same data set, we can see that as cows increase oleic acid intake, we tend to get greater energy partitioning to body weight. This is all post-peak cows, remember, okay, so this is all body weight gain in these instances. One slide I've not shown here, when Crystal did the Abomasal infusion work in post-peak cows to primarily look at fatty acid digestibility, as soon as we Abomasally infused 20 grams a day of oleic acid, we increased plasma insulin levels. So we think some of these effects on body weight and nutrient partitioning are being driven by plasma insulin. And I think I'll show some of that in a couple slides time. So that's the data I wanted to show on post-peak cows. I wanted to focus now the last 10-15 minutes here really on our work in early lactation cows, because again, I think this is somewhere where we're challenging some older perceptions or dogma on feeding fat or fatty acids to early lactation cows. The old traditional concept I've always, I was originally taught and still people tell me is that shouldn't feed supplemental fat to cows in negative energy balance. simply because they're already too much circulating fatty acids from body fat mobilization in that fresh period. Some of that comes from when you look at some of the reviews in the 90s of the original or some of that early work in fat feeding, where they reported that numerous trials that little benefit from feeding fat during the first 5 to 7 weeks postpartum, primarily because it wasn't looking like you were getting more energy into the cows in that, and I'll show a slide on that in a minute. You were getting depressions in feed intake. So if you're decreasing feed intake and feeding a more energy dense diet, you're not helping yourself there. But when you look at the studies that went into some of these conclusions, they were feeding very high levels of fat, often sort of saturated prils or highly unsaturated products such as soybean oil or tallow at very high levels. And that's really not what we do anymore. So we started to try and readdress that and take some of our knowledge and work in that post-peak cow and apply that to the fresh cow. This is a classic study, I think, that kind of showed that don't feed fat to fresh cows. It was a Palmitic stearic acid prill work, came out of Ron Butler's lab in the late 90s here. Basically showed that there was a treatment by time interaction. And in that early lactation period, cows fed the fat supplement had lower intakes, lower milk yields, lower energy intakes. And it was only after that first 4 weeks where these things started to address and come back the other way. So this concept of don't feed fat maybe in that fresh period. And I think our work now is really challenging some of those concepts. First thing to point out is I think that feeding fatty acids is very different to cows mobilizing fatty acids in the from adipose tissue. You know, when fatty acids are taken up by the small intestine, they're packaged into chylomicrons, primarily as triglycerides, and then they're available to different tissues before they even reach the liver. In a cow in negative energy balance, you know, those fatty acids are being released from adipose tissue as NEFA, and then directly, primarily available first pass to the liver. And, you know, we know some of those challenges with excessive plasma NEFA levels. So it's not like these fatty acids, when you're feeding them, are directly entering the same pool in the circulation and available the same way to different tissues. And I think that's an important thing to consider here. So some of the first work I was involved in was with Paola Piantoni, a graduate student with Mike Allen a few years ago. We fed a Palmitic stearic acid prill and fed it either on a lower or a higher forage NDF diets. And in that first period, the first 3 weeks or 4 weeks of lactation, those cows fed, this was at 2%. You'll see our later work were at lower levels now, increased intake, but tended to decrease milk yield, and therefore body condition score was better. They didn't lose as much body condition score. But when we tracked those cows over the carryover period, they had lower milk production as well. You know, they didn't lose as much body condition, but they had lower milk production. And particularly at that lower forage NDF with the fat supplement, they were about 10 kilos less in milk production in that carryover period. So in my mind here, there's always some balance, there's always some trade-offs here between, you know, minimizing body weight loss, body condition loss, and maximizing milk production. That's kind of where we focus some of our work on this lately. So I'll skip this one. So around the same time as Paola published that, Bill Weiss, a couple of years before, published a study where they fed the same Palmitic stearic prill from 3 weeks out to over 100 days in lactation. And you kind of saw some of the opposite effects in their low forage diet fed fat. They increased milk yield. In the high forage, they didn't, but they gained more body weight. So it was clear to us that it seemed like there were some effects, not just the types of fatty acids here, but the timing of when you would feed that fat, either in the fresh or what we would maybe call that peak period after they've come out of that fresh period. So our first study in fresh cows, obviously we hadn't done any work yet on palmitic acid in the fresh cow, and that was a very obvious area to look at. So we did this in a factorial design. We had with and without palmitic, and then we had either during the fresh or during the peak period. So we had cows either on control or palmitic acid, 1.5% added fat in the diet in the fresh period, and then we took them onto a high diet. So we dropped forage NDF, increased starch, increased fermentable starch, and then split these cows either into with or without palmitic acid. So we had 2 diets going to 4, and we'll have a similar design later on that I'll show you. What you see here is that when we fed the palmitic acid, we got nice improvements in energy-corrected milk, primarily fat yield, in both that fresh and the peak period. So those in the solid black line were nearly 5 kilos more energy-corrected milk throughout that whole 10-week period here compared to the control cows. Now, in that fresh period, some of that increased energy-corrected milk, this is a very large increase, was at the expense of additional body weight loss. It was about 26 kilos more body weight loss compared to control, and really not much difference in that post-peak, in that peak group period. Sorry. You can see most of that loss was in that 3rd week here, and I'm not showing the data here, but if you go to the studies that were published last year, you can see that this is where we kind of tailed off intake, and these cows are probably ready to switch after 2 weeks onto that high diet. But there's nothing really in the literature that would say that maybe additional body weight loss is a good thing from immune function, reproduction. I think this is manageable with some of these productions, but we were intrigued or wanted to know, could we improve or minimize this loss in body weight here while maintaining increased production? But if we did digestibilities on this study, and if you looked at energy intakes, you can see we got improvements in energy intake when we fed palmitic acid in the fresh and in the peak period here, and no interactions here, so it depended entirely on what they were fed during these respective periods. Again, you see that tailing off in that last week there because these cows would not continue to increase milk feed intake in that period there. Obviously, milk energy output was higher. Whoops. And then we did have that 1 week here where energy balance was noticeably different between these groups. Regardless of that, it's still noteworthy, I think, that all groups of cows got back into positive energy balance around week 6, week 7, all around the same time here. But that did lead us to look at what other alternatives were there to palmitic acid, just palmitic acid, which is manageable here, I think, but are there other alternatives? And of course, that sort of led us to look at some of our interest in oleic acid, given the effects that oleic acid has on digestibility, nutrient partitioning, plasma insulin. Could coming in with some different blends of palmitic and oleic acid have some effects in the fresh cow here? So we did a study here where it's just during the fresh period, we had our no added fat control, and then we made our sort of blends that we've used before, high palmitic to the higher oleic 80-10 to 60-30, simply made by taking a commercial palmitic krill and a commercial calcium salt. Fed these at 1.5% for the first 3 weeks from calving. This is just had the revisions back submitted for these, so hopefully they'll be out in the near future. Showing just that high palmitic acid here, first of all, intake, energy corrected milk, body weight. I just want to show this because consistency across studies. So this is exciting, I think. Compared to no added fat, that high palmitic acid diet, 1.5% diet, no differences on feed intake, same as what we saw in the previous study, about 4.5 kilos more energy corrected milk, again, similar to the previous study. And they lost about 25-30 kilos more body weight than control cows. Very similar across those studies. Now, when we come in with our other blends, so we lower the palmitic, come in higher oleic, and then the blue here is that 60-30. In this study, when we came in with more oleic acid, those cows ate more in the fresh period. So again, some of the perception with higher oleic acid or higher calcium salt type studies. This fits with some of Mike Allen's hepatic oxidation work, I think, nicely, because I'm not showing the data here, but when we came in with these, we had higher levels of NEFA, lower levels of circulated NEFA, high levels of insulin. I think that maybe helps with hepatic oxidation and driving more intake in these cows. Now, by week 2, those higher oleic blends are up at that similar level of energy corrected milk, as we saw with the high palmitic, but they did that without losing as much body weight as that high palmitic. And these cows actually lost about similar and a little bit less body weight than those cows on the no added fat control. So maybe there are some opportunities here where we're coming in with these palmitic oleic blends, we can get improved, increased milk production without additional loss in body weight, which is maybe a win-win situation in these situations. Well, this study got pretty interesting here, was that we then followed these cows out for another 7 weeks in a peak period. So all of these 4 groups here got a common diet in this period here. And, similar to what we did before, lower forage NDF, higher starch, higher fermentable starch. So we see improvements in milk production. But even though for these next 7 weeks, these 3 groups here are all on the same diet as the control group here, because we stimulated more milk production in this fresh period, we maintained higher milk production in this carryover period. So there seems like there's some, I'm not sure if programming is the right word, or if we set the cows up right here, we see continual milk production. Now, Barry Bradford's shown that with different nutrients and some pharmaceuticals in that fresh period as well. And there's other evidence about programming across different species. But that's quite exciting about getting these cows set up right here and longer term effects. Now, of course, our next question here was, what if we carried on with, say, a 60-30 blend, which we've shown in some of Jonas's work in post-peak very high producing cows was probably a good choice. If we fed that during this peak period, would we have got more milk production, or would we have stayed around at this level? So that was a study we just presented at Dairy Science this summer. We fed an actual calcium salt here that was now made to be a blend of 60% palmitic acid, 30% oleic acid, in line with our blend studies there. And you can see we did get this interaction here by looking. You see this this effective peak here, that if we fed that palmitic oleic blend here, we got the nice increase in milk production. And then this solid black line, these are cows that continued on that 60-30 blend compared to this black line where they went off the blend. And we saw we got a nice bump up yet again in milk production. So the solid red line is simply no added fat all the way through. This one here is the no added fat, and then the red dash is where they get that 60-30 blend only in the peak. So that's similar response to the cows that had the fat in the fresh and did not receive it in the black dash line in this peak period here. I realize it's a little confusing here and I've probably not explained it the best, but just see here this difference here, that if you maintain that, continue to feed that blend of palmitic oleic in both the fresh and the peak, we got incremental improvements in milk production. And again, that was done without any differences in body weight loss and body weight gain coming back here. You can see no significant effects on body weight here. So we're very excited about this sort of 60-30 blend in these cows here. Where we've done some work with Dr. Contreras' group is around some of these specific effects oleic acid may have in that fresh cow. And so we did some Crystal Prom from my lab, and then Andreas's lab did some work where we did some 60 grams a day of Abomasal infused, so bypassing the rumen of oleic acid. We can get 60 grams by feeding cows specific fat supplements. So we chose that 60-gram dose level. And then Andreas, after I think 7 days and 12 days of Abomasal infusion, 6 days and 12 days, sorry, of Abomasal infusions, he took adipose biopsies from these fresh cows. So we only started infusions from the day of calving for the first 12 days. And you can see there, he looked at lipolytic response, so release of NEFA from those adipose tissue, and then the sensitivity to insulin of that adipose tissue. And this gets really exciting here now, because this is some more sort of mechanistic evidence that these results showing that if we supplement, in this case we infuse them, if we supplement oleic acid to these fresh cows, we may reduce lipolytic response. So we may attenuate or reduce the amount of plasma of NEFA being released from adipose tissue, and we're also improving insulin sensitivity of that adipose tissue. So Andreas has some very interesting work on this now. He had a couple more abstracts at Dairy Science this summer. He and I just got a USDA grant to look at this some more further, and we're going to hopefully do some more work on this as we go forward here now. So I'm going to finish here now. Hopefully I've shown that clearly all these fatty acids have caloric effects, and hope if they're absorbed, supplying more energy to the cow. But there's lots of different what I call non-caloric effects of these different fatty acids. Different fatty acids can have different effects on intake, nutrient digestion, digestibility, and nutrient partitioning. In mammary gland, adipose tissue I've shown, and in other tissues as well. Finally, what I would say, if a nutritionist there or people in female, I know everyone gets bombarded with different types of fat supplements. So what would I ask, based on what I know and hopefully what I've shown you guys here, what would I ask someone when next time someone's trying to sell me a fat supplement? Number one question is, what's the fatty acid profile of the product? What's the total fatty acid content of the product? You got to remember, particularly when you're looking at cost, there's a Does a product contain 99% fatty acids or 80% fatty acids, depending what form it's in? But that's, this is the number one thing, that fatty acid profile. As I said earlier on, these are going to determine what impact, what effect on performance, and what type of management system might you be using those different products in. So then, what are my goals for feeding it? And then what fatty acids do I need to maybe help me meet those goals? And of course, where I don't really get involved in here is that economics that's changing on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, looking at some of those marginal returns as well. I like to look for consistency of product, quality of product, and obviously I'm biased, but I want to see supporting data, research data to support these different products as well. And I have this in the slide set. I'm not going to go through this. I think I've summarized it up. Many different groups help support this work shown here. This Michigan Alliance for Animal Agriculture has been a huge benefit to applied animal science researchers in Michigan the last few years, and that's been a great support from the university and many different industries, particularly the dairy industry, obviously, for me. VitaPlus helps support a number of our students through their fellowship, USDA, a number of different companies that help support different studies through products and support to the lab. So with that, I'm going to I'll pass it back over to you, Scott, and hopefully we can have some good discussion here now. So here's my email address. Feel free to reach out if anyone has any questions, comments, challenges, however, and we can continue to discuss that. Thank you, Scott.
Well, thank you, Adam. And before we get started answering questions, we'd like to share a brief video, and then we'll be right back to answer the questions submitted during today's presentation.
5 cents might not seem like much, but when it's 5 cents for every cow every day, then it really adds up. New Shure XM precision-release methionine provides the optimal combination of cost, feed stability, rumen stability, and intestinal release to deliver the best cost per unit of available methionine on the market today. Learn how at balchemanh.com/findyourx.
Adam, we've got several questions today. I'm going to select one from another Englishman. John would like to know the relationship between 16-0 supplementation and milk fat yields showed a slope of 0.25, meaning that 25% of what was fed reached the milk. Do you think we can improve on that?
Thank you, John from England. I hope you're well. Yeah, so that's an interesting one. That's a relationship pretty much of additional palmitic acid intake versus additional milk fat found. So, that number would be higher if you calculated it out from and absorbed. Fatty acids are typically 70% absorbed in dairy cows. That would be a higher number. But can we improve that? I think we probably can to some extent. If you think about triglycerides, milk fat is basically triglycerides. So you've got the glycerol and the free fatty acids on it. A triglyceride doesn't have free palmitic acids on it. It has some of these short chains, the de novo fatty acids, and oleic acid, and some other different fatty acids in there. So you have to supply all of those pieces. So, if there's a way of supplying some of these other fatty acids at the same time, oleic acid, I think, is a key one there, or some of these short chain de novo C4, coming from acetate and butyrate, we can probably improve that. And that's some of the work where we've tried to look at low and high fat basal diets as well. So I think there's some opportunity. It's about bringing all of those different pieces there. Kevin Harvatine has some interesting work where he infused additional acetate into the cow and showed some milk fat yield responses. So I've been thinking about, well, what if you did that in relation to increase more palmitic acid? If you had more of those other fatty acids that help complete that triglyceride, could we stimulate that more? There's some interesting things around some of the genetics around genes that are key drivers of milk fat as well. I think AGPAT, GPAT. There's something I need to look at more in the future. Are there some genetic differences there that as we breed cows and maybe more fat, more protein, does palmitic acid have different impacts on some of those? So I think there's some opportunity there, but of course, you know, we've got to take into account that some of it's not being absorbed. Obviously, some of these fatty acids are being utilized in other tissues as well. But I think that's something we need to look at more. Thanks, Scott.
Very well. We've received several questions related to biohydrogenation. And I'll ask this one, though, from a frequent questioner. James from Ohio is asking if 20 grams of added 18-1 increases fatty acid digestibility and calcium salts contain about 40% 18-1, and added 50 grams of product would provide 20 grams of 18-1 in the diet. How much of this is delivered to the small intestine versus being biohydrogenated?
Yeah, well, there's going to be a big range around that. And when we did our dose response Abomasal infusion, we spent a lot of time working out what our doses were going to be, and we went from 20 up to 60 grams. I think they are all realistic. If you, for example, had a calcium salt supplement that contains 38 to 40% oleic acid, and you fed it at anywhere between 1 and 2%, and you then could calculate out what your additional intakes of oleic acid were. So a common misperception is that rumen inert term means that the fatty acids are not impacted by bacteria and are not biohydrogenated. That's simply not true. There's still extensive biohydrogenation of oleic acid in a salt. It may be a bit less than oleic acid in regular feeds, but it's certainly not 100% protected. So we typically use, you know, Jenkins and Bridges have a review where they looked at this before. You know, there may be a range of 20% protection up to 60% protection. So, you know, if you had 100 grams of additional oleic acid in a product like that, which is quite attainable, you can certainly see how you could get anywhere from 20 to 50 or 60 grams coming through. A lot of that's going to depend on rumen pH. Rumen pH is a big driver of the release of those fatty acids off the calcium. Those fatty acids are only going to be biohydrogenated once they're released off the calcium, and that's really going to depend on rumen pH. So if James or Jim wanted to send me, I could show him our spreadsheet where we estimated why we got to those ranges. But I think all of that 20 to 60, they're all attainable in a real world situation.
Very well. Next, how much does fatty acid intake influence fatty acid digestibility?
Well, I hope I showed that quite well. In some of those slides there early on, I didn't show some of our meta-analysis work that Jackie Borman did with me. Jackie's at Purdue University now. There's clearly a linear effect that as you increase fatty acid intake, digestibility typically drops, and that's primarily driven by stearic acid flow increasing at the small intestine and stearic acid digestibility dropping. But for me, it's not just about total fatty acids, it's about that profile. I didn't show the slide, Dave, but we have a good example of where we fed soy hull-based diet versus a cottonseed-based diet. So we had very different levels of total fatty acid intake. But when we came in with a dose response of palmitic acid in that case, the drop in digestibility when we fed the saturated prill was less in the high-fat diet, which was a cottonseed diet, than it was in the soy hull diet. So it's not just about total flow. To me, it's more important is the profile. We know with cottonseed, you know, maybe somewhat similar to the calcium salt story there. With cottonseed, we get that slower release of fatty acid. We're probably getting some more unsaturated past the rumen. So to me, it's more about fatty acid profile in the small intestine than it is just simply fat intake and fat flow. To me, it's about getting those right fatty acids past the rumen.
All right, our next question comes from Western Canada. Santiago would like to know, suppliers are offering prilled and flaked palm fat in Western Canada. And in your experience, do you see any differences in digestibility?
We've not looked at a prilled versus a flaked. We did a study. I like to talk about data that we have or data that I know. We did a study where we looked at different prill sizes, and you know, none of them were huge prills, but prill size really didn't make much of a difference. This was sort of an average prill size down to even smaller prill size. So I don't think that's such a big piece of this. As long as your flakes aren't like huge cornflake type things, I don't think it's going to be a big difference. What I would suggest you want to check is that the form that those fatty acids in those two products are the same. Are they both free fatty acid products, or is one a triglyceride, one a free fatty acid product? You know, we do have data where you know, there's a lot of classic data from Firkins and different people showing that saturated triglycerides are less digestible than free fatty acid triglycerides. When we looked at that for palmitic acid products, the drop wasn't so dramatic for a palmitic acid enriched triglyceride compared to the more stearic acids in the past, but it was still noticeable, you know, 5-6 units, I think. So in general, I'd always say I'd take a free fatty acid product over a triglyceride. That'd be the first thing I'd check. The prill versus the flake, assuming the flakes aren't huge, I don't think it would make a big difference.
All right, very well. I've got a quick one for you. Victor would like to know.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Scott.
Yeah. No, Victor would like to know how many cows were used in your experiments.
Across all of them? No, in individual ones, it depends. It's well, we say in England, it's horses for courses. You know, most of our post-peak studies there are crossover Latin square type studies, and in general, anywhere from 24 to 32 cows for most of those. In those fresh cow studies, we typically had about 13 cows for treatment, so 54 cows. You know, they're all powered adequately for that type of study.
All right, very well. And the next one comes from Rolando. If palmitic acid stimulates the synthesis of ceramides and these cause insulin resistance, promoting the mobilization of body fat, would the use of fats with high levels of palmitic acid increase the risk of suffering from fatty liver and ketosis?
Well, some of that's based off some of the work that Joe McFadden's done at Cornell. And actually, Joe's actually taken samples from that fresh cow study of ours, and that was his data set. I think one of his data sets he showed where there was high levels of ceramide. One of the key ceramides I think he talks about is produced from palmitic acid. And so when he's fed in some studies palmitic acid, he does see increased ceramide synthesis and maybe some increased insulin resistance. You know, so in the fresh cow, certainly that could maybe be contributing to that additional body weight loss that we were seeing. Our study was not designed to look at health parameters, but there was no evidence of one way or another that cows are more or less ketotic. Interestingly, in many of our studies, we see higher BHB levels, but that's not a ketosis issue. I think that's they're still below levels, but like Mike Allen's had some studies lately where we see high ketone levels, which I think is probably a good thing in these type of studies. So I think, you know, maybe the ceramide piece there in the fresh cow with palmitic acid could be a concern. And, you know, we've got high levels of milk production, a bit more body weight loss, and that's a balancing act that different depending on management and what's needed there may or may not be an issue. And that's why we focus more on that oleic. And certainly, as I showed, that oleic acid piece addresses some of those things. We're actually doing a study now where we're looking at palmitic acid with and without chromium in the fresh cow to see if that addresses some of the maybe that incidence story there as well. Now, the ceramides, I think, is an important piece here. It's one part of a multifactorial component. So, other groups are looking at eicosanoids and oxylipids and different things. So there's lots of these different signaling molecules that can come into play. But, you know, I think that can be a piece there. But, you know, if I listen to some of the stuff Joe does and our own thinking on that, maybe some of that insulin resistance and that high levels of palmitic acid kind of fits in with our work on why a higher palmitic acid is probably good in a post-peak cow, less than 100-pound cow, where I would probably say I'd go with that high palmitic acid to get maximum milk production, because we want to maintain more nutrients going to the mammary gland to maximize milk production in that situation.
All right, very well. We're getting a bit long on time. I'm going to ask one more, and then we'll close. Juan would like to know, do you have any experience using high level of palmitic at the same time of high level of starch to increase milk fat that was decreased by this level of starch?
Well, there's plenty of examples in the field for that I've seen, probably. I'm not sure I would want to do that. If I had a milk fat depression situation, throwing palmitic acid in there, I don't think is the fix. It could maybe hide the problem, but it's not a fix. It's kind of like putting a band-aid over a broken leg, I think. If this question was maybe coming from a milk fat depression situation, I'm not sure, but I would want to address the underlying issue of what was causing that. Is it the amount of starch? Is how fermentable the starch is? You certainly, if you have a really severe milk fat depression situation, throwing palmitic acid is not going to do anything, because you've got other factors overriding that, which are attenuating or shutting down both de novo and preformed fatty acid synthesis in the mammary gland and dropping milk fat. In a milder case, you could maybe sort of hide it a bit, but I would use palmitic acid in any and all cases as a way to help promote maximum milk fat synthesis, but you still need to address rumen pH, the amount of unsaturated fatty acids in the diet. And for me, rumen pH is the key driver of risk for milk fat depression.
All right, and with that, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Locke. I'd remind everyone that if your specific question was not answered today, Dr. Locke will be answering those, and will be placing those at ANH at marketing.com. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for attending today's webinar, and a special thanks to our first-time listeners that were listening in on our Spanish simulcast. If you'd like to comment on the translation service, or if you have additional questions, please submit them to nh.marketing@balchem.com, and we'll forward them to you along with the unanswered questions from today's session. Remember, you can receive 1 ARPAS credit from today's webinar. A certificate of participation is available to download in the Handouts tab on your control panel. This month, Balchem is launching an extension of the Real Science Lecture Series in podcast form called the Real Science Exchange. But this won't be just any boring podcast. You'll get to know top researchers like you've never known them before. Go behind the scenes and hear the conversations that take place over a few drinks with friends. Join us as we discuss the hot topics in dairy science and share a range of new ideas. Search for Real Science Exchange on your favorite podcast platform, Apple, Google, Spotify, etc. The first podcast will feature Dr. Mike Van Amberg and Buzz Burhans. The next Real Science lecture is in our ruminant series will be on November 10th instead of the regular first Tuesday of the month due to the elections in the United States. Dr. Marina van Keiserlink from the University of British Columbia will continue our discussion on social responsibility with a presentation titled Animal Agriculture, Renewing Our Social License. We've also recently added a monogastric series to our podcast, to our Real Science portfolio. Our first monogastric webinar will be broadcast next week, October 13th, and is titled Insights into a Common Goal, Stopping the Spread of African Swine Fever, with Dr. Scott D. from Pipestone Veterinary Services. Visit balchemanh.com/realscience for more details and to register. On behalf of Balchem and Dr. Locke, thank you for joining us today.